Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to You Alive, organized by NUS Alumni Relations. My name is Althea, an alumni of Yale NUS College, and I will be your MC for this evening. Please note that this event is being recorded for archival and marketing purposes. It will be available on the You Alive website within a week. NUS Alumni Relations may use some or all of these images and videos in its publications, digital platforms, and/or marketing channels. You Alive, launched in January 2011, is a key initiative of the NUS Alumni Advisory Board and has since featured over 60 accomplished members of the NUS community and global thought leaders. You Alive, Lifting Thought Leadership features a distinguished panel to address global issues that are significant to Singapore and beyond. To ensure the best experience for everyone, please keep your video and audio turned off. If you have a question, please type it into the chat window. Your question will be reviewed by the moderator and may be grouped with similar questions to be answered. In building up to tonight's discussion, we held an essay competition from 6 January to 29 February. The participants were NUS alumni and students from local universities and polytechnics, and the competition sought to generate critical viewpoints and innovative solutions related to tonight's topic. May we now invite the academic lead, Associate Professor Leong Ching, NUS Dean of Students, to share the highlights from the essay competition. Prof. Leong, please.
The conflict between, good evening, everybody. I'm not sure if you heard my sort of scintillating start, but here I go again. Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. We received a lot of high-quality submissions, about more than 50, and the contestation between today and tomorrow was very clear. One main theme that we found was the reduction of this contest into economics, meaning growth versus preservation. And quite a lot of the essays talked about how our presentism, our bias towards present gratification enabled this sort of contest to be a very one-sided one. Another theme that we found was a lot of the essays thought how hard it was to change human behavior and how much of what we find ourselves today was the result of the bias and heuristics that are pervasive in everyday life. And third, and maybe quite sort of understandably, many of the essays sort of threw up their hands in despair and just said, it's very difficult to find any form of solution. But you will see tonight the essayist who is with us tonight, Feng Yuan, a really optimistic view, and I do hope that she represents the view of many young people of Singapore. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Leong. Without further ado, may we welcome Ms. Feng Yuan, student winner and first runner-up of the You Alive essay competition, to share her perspective on the topic, climate change. Are tomorrow's needs more important than today's reality? Ms. Feng, please.
Thank you. Thank you. Good evening, I'm Feng Yuan. Climate change is a hard question, but undoubtedly it is a true test to humanity. Answers as to how we can tackle climate change are actually obvious. Government, businesses, and individuals all know what to do. But the hesitation lies in why are tomorrow's needs worth the sacrifice of today's reality? First, it is important to define what are the needs and realities in question. Tomorrow's needs refers to the need to survive and the need to maintain at a decent level of economic vibrancy that sustains lives. In the meanwhile, today's reality means the most directly impactful trade-offs, economic costs, and livelihood. Tomorrow's needs are more important than today's reality because the cost of today's reality is not actually as high as claimed. The economic recession is manageable. And we are actually spending more to recover from disasters than the amount we need to mitigate climate change. Hence, why not suffer in a temporary economic trade-off for a cheaper deal in the long term? Next, are we actually losing from catering to tomorrow's needs? Economic costs of tackling climate change are discussed, yet one overlooks the true cost of not tackling climate change. The costs seem to be far from us, but they're definitely predictable and fatal. So analyzing the entire scene, we are fearful of being less wealthy, but we are willing to embrace the annihilation of civilizations. And that is so ironic. This argument of comparative consequentialism is clear-cut, but some are like, no, I do not want to suffer. But this mindset is more like cowardice. Finally, think of this. Millions of children are suffering. They lose their best friends in disasters, their sisters, and even their parents. The childhood playgrounds are eroded, the safe sanctuary gulped by tsunamis. And in less than 14 years, that will be us and our children and everyone born into that era who were never responsible for any of these sufferings. And we will mourn if we're even lucky enough to survive. Well, the good news is that we are already equipped with the ability to tackle climate change. However, that is only 20% of the question. Now the question lies in how to utilize that power. Tackling climate change should be a cooperation. Different stakeholders, countries, people from diverse backgrounds have to be informed, engaged, and committed in climate change. Hence, the first step is distribution of burdens. Contribution to climate change need not to be quantitatively equal, but definitely proportionately equal. The concept of equity, the concept that everyone should bear the proportionate amount of trade-offs and gain the proportionate amount of benefits, plays a prominent role. This can be achieved with 4 principles. Equity allows stakeholders to have meaningful involvement in tackling climate change and grants the space and ability for appropriate amounts of contributions that will not exacerbate the inequality existent in development today. In the meanwhile, community participation is also a key to solving climate change. Adaptation strategies need to be top-down and bottom-up. This is especially important in small island developing states, where a large proportion of the population live in rural areas that are not strongly supported by government institutions. Therefore, it is incumbent on local communities to independently initiate and implement adaptation strategies that reflect their needs and values. In the meanwhile, top-down involvement needs to shape adaptive capacity within a community. Well, an example of this is Northeast Victoria of Australia. 3 pilot community engagement program was initiated in vulnerable communities to achieve public participation. Residents developed a vision of climate resilient community and tested an emergency planning resource developed for seniors by the Red Cross. The engagement of the community raised awareness, preparedness, and hence resilience. Last but not least, international cooperation. Well, this is already a common practice today, but I would just like to stress on the idea that as countries seek to maintain their environment nationally, climate change is, after all, a global crisis. It does not only affect a piece of land, but also the waters, the wildlife, and all humans. A loss to another country means a loss to humans as a whole in fighting this crisis. Hence, it is only wise if developed countries will lend a helping hand to developing countries who may not have the financial and social capability to adapt to climate change. The technologies and solutions we have right now are still financially demanding, but time left for us to fight for survival is limited. Hence, it is urgent and essential for all of us to adopt a cosmopolitan mindset and support one another. Equity, engagement of all stakeholders, and international cooperation is essential in solving the climate crisis. While we are clear of the concrete steps to take, the practical, moral, and psychological aspects of all assert that a trade-off of today's reality to tackle climate change for tomorrow's needs is essential and justified. Well, as a student here today, I want to call for all youth to initiate actions. Well, volunteer at NGOs, start your own community project, or simply raise awareness through dialogues in everyday life. Do not be scared. Do not feel unqualified, because every small act makes a huge difference, and you will be appreciated by a thank you from 100 years ahead. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Ms. Feng. I would now like to hand over the time to our moderator, Mr. Vishwa Sadasivan, former nominated Member of Parliament, Chairperson of the You Alive Organising Committee, and member of the NUS Alumni Advisory Board. Mr. Vishwa, please.
Thank you, Anthea. Good evening and welcome to You Alive. Today we discuss a topic that's very critical by all counts, but somehow it has failed to become enough of a priority. Is it a question of ignorance, of denial, or downright lack of accountability? Well, I hope to be able to get down to the answers to these questions honestly today. Now, before that, let's agree on some definitions. What's climate change really? It refers to the disruption in the long-term seasonal weather patterns caused by global warming. This has led to climate destabilization, causing extreme weather patterns, which we are witnessing fairly regularly these days. Now, global warming has also led to food and drinking water shortage, as well as has had an impact on the economy. For example, it's estimated that if global temperature rise hits 2.5 degrees Celsius, global GDP will shrink by 15%. Now, that's quite significant at a global level. So what's been the climate change journey so far? It actually started in earnest in 1987, the Brundtland Commission report, where the notion of sustainable development was popularized. Then in 2005, we saw the Kyoto Protocol, where for the first time, carbon emission limits were set essentially for developed economies. Yet soon after, this is quite amazing, soon after the Kyoto Protocol of 2005, overall global emissions soared with USA, China, and India as key emitters. More recently, in 2015, there was the Paris Agreement, or COP21, as is often called, within the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, or UNFCCC. It was a landmark agreement with a commitment to keep global temperature rise this century to well below 2 degrees Celsius. The same year, in 2015, we also saw the UN member states approving the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. The aim is threefold: end poverty, fight inequality, and tackle climate change. Now, yet, with all these initiatives over the past 20, 30 years, right, we still see the problem of climate change still as largely looming as it used to be. It's not an easy problem to solve, obviously. Most of the countries severely affected by climate change are less developed countries. For example, Southeast Asian countries, right? So rapid change, if rapid change is forced onto these countries, there could be serious social and economic consequences that these countries may not be able to tackle adequately. Then there's the economy versus the environment trade-off. There's also the larger trade-off between what experts call the tyranny of the contemporary versus the accountability to future generations. And that's what we're here to talk about. The question is it just rhetoric or is it a reality? Is it really that difficult to find common ground between future needs and today's reality? Are we trying hard enough? What's holding us back from real change? What is it that we can do differently? You know, our young lady, Feng Yuan, had highlighted some of her ideas, and we will delve into that more. I promise you that, Feng Yuan. This is why we have decided that today the topic has to be climate change. Are tomorrow's needs more important than today's reality? To help us navigate this complex issue and find workable solutions, we have a distinguished panel. Ms. Grace Fu, Singapore's Minister for Sustainability and the Environment. Mr. Abbas J, Practice Manager, Urban Disaster Risk Management, Southeast Asia Region, World Bank Group. Abbas is also leading a global team on infrastructure lending, technical assistance, and advisory services in the World Bank. Associate Professor Leong Ching. Apart from being the NUS Dean of Students, she's also Associate Professor with the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. Her work lies in making sense of what's apparently irrational environmental behavior, which is going to be very relevant in today's discussion. She uses narratives, perceptions, and stories to understand collective public behavior as well as environmental identities. Last, but certainly not least, the young lady that we heard just now, right? Ms. Feng Yuan. She's the essay competition runner-up. She's a runner-up winner. She's a secondary school student with secondary 4 student with Raffles Girls Secondary School. Feng has been actively engaged in coastal cleanup efforts and is committed to leading an environmentally friendly lifestyle. So I'm sure Minister Grace Fu will be very happy to hear of young people who are rolling up the sleeves and doing such great work. Well done, Feng Yuan. So here's, to kick off the discussion, here's a quick question for all our panelists. What's holding us back? What's really the factors that are holding us back from finding common ground between future needs and today's realities? Perhaps we'll start with the Minister.
Thank you very much, Wiswa. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for having me. It's a really great question to start off the discussion. I will just very briefly talk about some of the factors that I think are important. I'm sure I'll learn from the panelists, from their perspective as well. I will basically bring 3 factors for discussion. The first is that, countries are different. They come with different developmental stages. They have different needs. Some of them have the ability to fund some of the longer term projects. Some of them are really struggling as we are all coping with COVID, the public health threats and also economic challenges ahead of us. Secondly, I think we have different circumstances. A small island like Singapore is quite different from a country as vast as Australia, for example. We do not have as many options in renewable energies. For example, we don't have geothermal, we don't have hydro, and certainly I think we are not quite suitable for nuclear option as well. So we come with different background, we come with different sizes, we come with different stage of economic development. That's one. Secondly, we also have different, priorities. For example, if you look at some countries, they're heavily invested in fossil. They rely on fossil for a big part of their fiscal policies. If the fossil fuels continue to stay at $40, some of the government will have very little to spend on their public budgets. So for some of these countries, they have a lot of vested interest to keep things as it is now. So different countries, different situation, different political motivations. The third factor that I would say is it's our belief in science. Some countries look at science, look at data, and understand what data is telling us. Some of us choose not to believe in data. Secondly, some of us think that technology has the solutions, but they are not mature enough for us to do it cost effectively. And indeed, I think that's probably where a large group of countries or companies fall in. We believe that we need to look for technological solutions. There are many technological solutions that are promising, but many of them have not reached the level of maturity for us to invest in huge quantity or in great extent in that technology. Secondly, we also need to have the humility sometimes to accept that we don't understand every equation in sustainability. There are some options that seem very good on paper, but I think there are downstream issues that we may not know. We may not know what kind of repercussions or consequences a certain path or a certain technology will bring us. So some of the very emerging issues such as hydrogen, such as carbon storage, these are very promising technology, but I think there's still a lot that we do not know about this technology, the consequences of the technologies that will give us the confidence to go into it in a very big way. So I think these are the few factors that I'll just put on the table. There are many, many others, including societal needs, cultural differences that makes us different and make us think differently. But I will just leave with these three for consideration. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Just a quick question for us to understand what you said better. Could you give us an example of some of the tech solutions that Singapore is actually looking at this point in time, examining it? Could you fill us in on that?
So for example, like hydrogen as a source of fuel, it doesn't have carbon. So when you burn it, it's hydrogen, oxygen, water, right? But how do you get clean hydrogen? That's the question. We could get hydrogen from, say, Australia, but how does Australia extract hydrogen? That's another question. How much energy is being put to extract hydrogen? And how do we transport hydrogen? What's the carbon footprint of hydrogen from Australia to Singapore, for sake of argument? So these are all part of this energy equation that we need to study. We cannot just look at the use of it in Singapore, but we have to look at all the downstream and upstream implication of that option.
Thank you. Abbas?
Thank you, Vishwa, and good evening, Madam Minister, fellow panelists, and all participants. Thank you for the invite. I want to begin by congratulating Feng Wan. Really great job. I was so impressed by your essay. So let me just follow up from where the minister left off. So I want to make 3 points here. So the first is that there is no future or no present in this discussion, right? The future is already here. The Prime Minister of Bangladesh, about a month ago, she wrote a very powerful op-ed in The Guardian saying that 1/3 of her country is underwater. If current trends persist, about 2/3 of Bangladesh is going to disappear because of sea level rise. And Bangladesh is not just the only country. Just look at the last 5 years. Every major city in the world, probably in Asia and Africa, has had a major flooding event. South of China this year, Hyderabad just last week, the whole of Northeast India. So, there is no, we talk about these things as if being in the future. It's happening now. So that is one thing we need to be very clear, that the future has already arrived. The second thing I want to mention is that there are huge distortions in the market. When we talk about, say, renewable energy not being affordable, I think that's just plain wrong. So the IMF did a very nice paper a couple of years ago, and they estimated that fossil fuel subsidies is about $5.2 trillion. Just imagine, if those subsidies were instead put to use for, say, R&D or financing renewable energy, we would be in a different situation today. So that is, again, one of the big challenges in front of us, that how do we remove these unnecessary barriers and distortions to the market? And the third and final point I want to make is, I think the minister made a very good point on technology. So if you just had asked somebody, say, 5 years ago, nobody could have predicted that solar energy is going to be the cheapest source of energy on the planet, right? So about 6 months ago, there was a solar auction in Morocco, and the cost of electricity was about 2 cents per kilowatt hour. That is the cheapest and any source that can provide. So the technology in some senses is here. The question is, then how do we utilize it? That said, I do agree with the minister that there are certain industrial processes, like, Bill Gates has this famous quote where he says, whenever somebody comes to him with a climate action plan, his first question is, what's your plan for steel? And the thing is that steel and cement, for example, are very carbon intensive. But here's another statistic for you. This week's Economist has a very interesting statistic, which says that the amount of R&D in renewable energy for the whole planet is just about twice what Amazon, one company, invests in a year. So that's ridiculous, right? This one company is, and the entire global R&D in renewable energy, it shouldn't be comparable, right? We should be doing 10, 20, 100 times more. So there's so much we can do if we have the right mindset. I'll leave it here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Abbas, could you give us a little bit more of an insight on what you meant by, specifically on what you meant by distortions?
So
you gave an example of Amazon as one example, but more examples.
So the fossil fuel subsidy is a great example, right? Many countries subsidize their fossil fuels like, gasoline or kerosene or liquefied natural gas. Now they do it on valid concerns. There are a lot of poor people who need access to clean sources of energy. So for example, in India, they have a program to subsidize liquefied natural gas so that, you can cook through a clean source of energy. Fair enough. But at the end of the day, there are better ways of doing this. So you can guarantee clean access without, using fossil fuels, for example. But the problem is that to unwind these subsidies is politically very tricky. So, for example, in Nigeria, they tried to do it and they had rioting on the streets because people were worried about what's going to happen.
And governments get overthrown.
Possibly. So, but again, there are ways of doing it. You can shield the poor. Now you can have direct transfer of benefits, through mobile accounts, money accounts, and so on and so forth. So the targeting is much easier, much simpler. So there are ways of unwinding these subsidies. But the sad fact is that, the recipients of these subsidies often are not poor, but they are very politically very powerful. So it is politically hard to do, but I feel it's imperative that we have to address this issue of distortions, and primarily here I mean fossil fuel subsidies.
Thank you. We'll come back to the issue of political will later in the conversation. Leong Ching?
So I was going to pick up on the point of political
will.
I'm going to pick up on the point of political will, but in answer to your question, right, why is it so hard to find common ground? I was going to say price. So the limits of price as a mechanism to organize common behavioral responses is well tested, and it's easy, right? How much is this? How much how much does it cost? What's demand and supply? Usually, price is a highly efficient allocative mechanism, and it works most of the time. But it fails in economics, in economic terms, in the environment. So, for example, a lot of environmental resource is underpriced. What is the price of free air? What is the price of clean water? So I'll give you an example of water. You would think water, you can get a price, right? So in many other countries, so in Singapore, we are one of the rare countries which are actually priced to cost recovery. But so in many other countries, they underprice, thinking that it's a sort of right and essential to life, extremely politically hard to raise water price. And you will see in Singapore also, it was difficult for the Singapore government to do that. But the reason that people think that the price of water is low, for example, in Kathmandu, where the water utility had been delayed for 30 years, a lot of times people underprice their own time and own inconvenience and the public health risk of not getting a safe, secure, reliable source of water via water utility. So they would rather sort of buy little sort of small supplies from water vendors rather than have a sort of big investment in water infrastructure. Same argument for Abbas' earlier point about the flooding event. The flooding events come because of over-extraction of water quite a lot of the time. And why do people have over-extraction? It's because the water utility, again, is unreliable, or they perceive it to be expensive. Truth is, if you look at Jakarta's thinking, they're going to spend $40 billion as one of their options to build the Great Garuda Wall, sort of as a bulwark against seawater intrusion. Again, if you look at it as a mere cost-benefit analysis, somehow it doesn't seem to work out for sums, right? Largely, I think the price mechanism somehow has met its match in environmental resources. And that's part of the difficulty why we find it hard to find common ground to move on sort of broad agreement. And hence, the issue of political will becomes really important because pricing is not a matter of high economics. it's a matter of being clear-minded, a belief in data, and of course the will to price it, even when we know what the true cost is.
So, what is your take, Leong-Ching, based on your research, in shifting perceptions? You're an expert in behavior, human behavior, understanding human behavior, including understanding human behavior among the political elite, among key stakeholders who have influence on the political elite, and so on. What do you think can be done to shift behavior by presenting arguments that are pro-environment, pro-sustainability as yesable propositions?
Right. So I guess the key question, and maybe Minister will, of course, know this better than I do, but the policy research shows that salience is a really large variable that weighs on the minds of the electorate and hence the bureaucrats and policymakers. So when something is not perceived to be salient, even though it's really important, then it's really hard to get any action on it.
What do you mean by salient?
So some things are invisible, right? Some threats are invisible. You can't see when your city has been sinking because it creeps up on you day by day. So that's really hard to kind of get galvanize people on, right? I mean, some things are just boring, right? Like fixing leaking pipes is just boring. But if you do fix the pipes that nobody can see, you know that your water supply increases by 40%, because quite a lot of countries, they lose a fifth or 40% of their water just by not fixing the pipes. But it just sounds like it's so boring and nobody's going to win any election but say, oh, you know what, I fixed the pipes, right? So the salience is really important.
Yeah.
And when the salience is not there, it's really hard to get things moving.
Yeah, and it must, if it poses a more near and present danger, there's a much better chance of people being incentivized to tackle it. But when something is large and somewhat amorphous like climate change issues, I think it probably goes back to the saliency question, right? It's a very, very difficult issue to tackle, and I hope that we'll spend some time today, especially since the minister is here, you know, to deal with some of these things, because I'm aware, Minister, perhaps you can shed some light on this. I'm aware that Singapore plans to play a more significant role in regional communication and conversations in this particular space. Would you want to quickly comment on that, where we are and what our commitment is in that? I think you're muted.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think recently, just last week, if you have been following news on energy, you will notice a very significant announcement, which is the partnership between Singapore and Malaysia on the power grid. We have agreed to, buy some power from electricity from Malaysia, and although we have not worked out the details, but we're likely to buy renewable energy. Why is this news so significant? Because it signifies the willingness to work together. As you know, in Singapore, power security has always been an important issue, just like water security. But the fact that we're reaching out to other countries, Malaysia, Australia, to discuss shared grid, it's a sign that we are going to look past our individual interests and look at opportunities for cooperation. And when that happens, I think this is where we can talk about cooperation on the energy level. Countries that are now thinking about a green recovery, thinking about installing solar farm as a way to export electricity, will find possible potential buyers. So I think that it's not all gloom and doom. There are new areas where will allow us to grow, and also new technology to adopt. If I may, Viswa, to just maybe take a crack at Alvin Chan's question through the chat box about electric car. As you all know, that we have already announced that by 2040, we will move entirely to electric vehicles, passenger cars. Why do we need to make that announcement? Because if we don't make that clear, the industry, the combustion industry as we know it, cars that run on diesel or gasoline, will be entrenched, because this is a very mature technology. Manufacturing plants all over the world have such scale and experience in producing such cars that they are at the lowest marginal cost. So for a new form of technology to have a crack at the market, you need to, in a way, use some government lever like a regulation to signal a change. And because in order to get ourselves, shifting from one form of energy to another, obviously the infrastructure will have to change. And that's the reason why we need to give ourselves really a good lead time to prepare for infrastructure such as electrical charging points. At the same time, oil companies, the likes of Caltex or BP, that have just invested on all these petrol stations along the road. If you do not give them a proper lead time, that's not very fair, is it? Because some of them may have just invested, in a business and set up the infrastructure. So that's the reason why sometimes decisions need that lead time. We can have the process now. We need to have a plan ahead, and we need to give businesses, we need to give individuals, car buyers like Alvin Chan, to start looking at electric car, and knowing that we're going to go full electric. It's really going to shift the air quality, the air emission quality in Singapore.
Yeah, I think that's great to hear, Minister. I guess a follow-up question, and this has come up in various conversations, that there's a suggestion that Singapore is a little slow in moving into this space. We could have actually gone ahead in electric cars, or even provided greater incentive for solar energy generation earlier. How would you respond to that? That we could have actually, that we are somewhat behind the curve, so to speak.
So I think that we need to be quite realistic. I mean, we like to think that on the area of in the area of sustainability, we are realists. We are not alarmists. Neither are we, in denial. We are realists. We look at the science. We look at the data. We look at what's feasible, what needs to get us to a stage where the technology has matured enough, like electric car. We think that there's sufficient evidence to us that it's going to be, it's a useful and it's a commercially viable idea before we take the plunge. For a very simple reason, we are not a market mover when it comes to solar energy. We are such a small country in terms of energy usage that even if we go 100% solar, we are not going to change the industry. So we can't influence solar in a very big way in terms of its production, in terms of its cost. Who are the people that will change this equation? China. China is now producing more than 90% of the world's solar PV. And when China says that they're going to go carbon neutral at 2060, I think you have a fair idea why they have that confidence of doing so. They have sufficient alternative. They know that they are not there yet. None of us are there yet, but they have some policy leverage that they have some certainty of achieving. And therefore they make that, that move. So for us, we are not, in that position to steer the industry in solar. We are not in the, we are not steering the technology on electric vehicle, for example. So we have to, in a way, follow. We're a very, very close follower. We may not be there leading the way, but we want to be there understanding where it's heading, and then make a decision very, very quickly that will meet the needs of Singaporeans.
Thank you, Minister. Feng Yuan, don't worry, we haven't forgotten you. I guess this has given you enough time to warm up. Is there anything else that you'd like to add apart from what you presented earlier on?
Yes, actually, I would like to talk about elaborate on mindset and the ability and space for individuals to be committed to climate change. So firstly, about mindset, there is still a debate about whether climate change is real. And I think that mindset of denial actually distracts us from the entire debate of how to tackle climate change, because some people are still not admitting the fact that it exists. And other than that, I think on an individual level, there's a willingness to really sacrifice oneself to adopt a more sustainable way of life. For example, if you tell someone that you need to sacrifice your December holiday vacation just to reduce the carbon footprint, they wouldn't actually be willing to do that. So I think mindset is actually something that is a big factor for everyone to commit to climate change. In terms of ability and space, I would like to comment on the dependency of our economy on carbon footprint. It is actually very surprising to know that most of the carbon footprint in the supply chain comes from consumerism. So when you consume the product, it produces the most carbon. So to tackle climate change, are we actually going to reduce consumerism? Then how are our economies going to run? There's no alternative substitute to the current economic system. And therefore, it's very unlikely that we can actually work on that aspect. And in the meanwhile, for developing countries, a lot of them are actually dependent on outsourcing. So they have factories that run on fossil fuels in their country. And that is the primary industry that supports the livelihood of all its people. So, but it's not possible to tell them that, hey, switch to renewable energies and raise the cost, because they will actually lose the outsourcing opportunities, and their people will just fall again into poverty and starvation, which is detrimental to developing countries. So there's actually no space, and we don't have the and countries actually don't have the ability to shift to a more sustainable way of life and economy.
Okay, wonderful. So Feng Yuan, let me ask you this. There have been some people who have criticized Singaporean youth as not having enough fire in the belly compared to youth in other countries. You know, that we are too spoiled, we are too entitled, and we really don't feel it deep in, and therefore not prepared to lead the charge, so to speak. We are quite content to be followers. These are allegations leveled at Singapore youth. How would you respond?
I think the claim about us being a bit spoiled.
Not a bit, sometimes a lot.
I'll say a bit.
Okay.
Is true to some extent, because we just can't live off aircon. And that actually creates a lot of carbon footprint. But I will say that we are all very genuinely concerned about climate change, seeing how personally in my school, we have a lot of community projects initiated by passionate students to tackle climate change. They do fundraising activities, and they cooperate with the local organizations. And they actually do a lot of raising awareness on the social media and within the community itself. So I would say that if it's not passion, then nothing would have driven them to do such great contributions to tackle climate change. So I would say that although we may be a bit spoiled in terms of aircon, but we are really, really concerned, and we are ready to take the charge to tackle climate change.
You know that after this, the minister is going to come after you, right? To enlist your support. And you and your tribe will join the minister in making that difference.
Absolutely right, Wisma.
Okay, so there's one other question I have for you, Feng Yuan. In your paper, in your essay, you had said that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, made one recommendation, and that was to slow down the economy. The slowing down the economy approach. That maybe if the whole world, the global economy slows down a little bit, the pressure on the climate would be reduced. There's more room for us to make those adjustments. How would you respond to that? You included that in your paper. Yes,
I think it is actually a valid suggestion that we should be going for, because based on statistics, there's only a 0.1% reduction of, slowdown of economy, which is still manageable in the for the globe. And it is actually very important to note as well that we're actually spending more on mitigating in investing into the recovery from natural diseases than the amount that's required to switch to renewable energy and tackle climate change. So although it can be a temporary slowdown, maybe for a few years, but in the long term, it is actually cheaper and more beneficial for everyone. So I think looking at the long term, it is a very good deal for everyone.
Good deal, even if you don't get a job.
Mm,
Are you going to be happy to not have a job, perhaps, if you slow down the economy? I'm just playing devil's advocate.
I would say that that may be a problem, but looking at the future, we might just be it can be a problem of survival, not just employment, that we may be affected by natural disease and natural disasters, and people are gonna die, and that is not just the problem of wages. And I think unemployment can actually be mitigated in the short term by subsidies and maybe considering like unemployment benefits.
Yeah, Abbas, I'd like to put that question to you as well. You have been advising countries in Asia, South Asia as well as East Asia. How would you respond to IPCC's recommendation of slowing down the economy?
I don't accept that there's a dichotomy between jobs and green growth, if we want to define it that way. I was just looking when you were talking to Feng Wan, I was quickly had a look. The fastest growing occupation in the US is wind turbine mechanic. So that gives you a sense of where the jobs are. Solar panel installers. There are many, much more, not in absolute number, or not just in absolute number, but growth rates in renewable energy is far more than fossil fuel industry. So really the future is in these industries. So there is no trade-off. I don't buy that at all. And I think Feng Wan made a very good point, which is that if you look at just the losses from natural disasters caused by climate, it's about $18 billion a year.
Yeah.
And indirect losses is about $490 billion a year. That is a lot of money. The World Bank has put out several reports which says that perhaps the absolute best investment that any country can make is in early warning systems and hydrometeorological services. $1 invested in early warning system can save up to $8 of avoided losses. And I do want to give you an example from Bangladesh, which is that Bangladesh is one of the best examples in the world of a country which is still very poor, but they have invested in early warning systems and they have brought down their death rates from cyclones dramatically. So in 1970, they had a cyclone called Bhola, where by some estimates, hundreds of thousands of people were killed. Fast forward, 35 years, in 2008, I think Cyclone Sidr hit Bangladesh, same intensity, and fewer than 1,000 people died. Now, of course, every death is a tragedy, but just look at the difference in scale. And they did that by investing in community resilience in early warning systems. So it can be done, and poverty is not an excuse. Bangladesh is still a very poor country, but they have been an astonishing success. And there are other countries also. India has done a very good job also on this front. Yeah. So I don't.
So when you talk about slowing down, the prospect of slowing down economies, right? Again, if let's say there's a global sort of decision to move in this direction of slowing down the global economies, it's not going to impact on all economies the same way, right? Certain economies will bear the brunt of it. Perhaps, for argument's sake, Singapore, where we are not really that badly hit, we may say, look, why should we slow down our economy? We have different, as the minister highlighted, right? We have different countries have different priorities, and at different stages of economic development. So you will have inequities in the way different countries respond, and that in itself will start causing a global issue. Why, just like in nuclear proliferation and so on, when you try and apply global standards across the board, you're not factoring the point that different economies, different countries will have shifting priorities and therefore at different levels of development. How will we cope with that?
So let me respond to you in this way, which is that COVID-19 is an opportunity really for the countries when they start rebuilding after this pandemic. It gives them an opportunity to rebuild in a better way, what we call build back better, right?
That's right.
The poorer countries, the developing countries don't need to make the same mistakes that the developed countries did. So a good example of that is, say, the mobile phone network, right? Many countries in Africa went straight from no phone to mobile.
They leapfrogged.
They didn't stop at landlines, right? So you just leapfrog, exactly. So for example, smart grid technology, which enables renewable energy to be deployed at scale. You could go straight there. You know, there are countries which don't have a functioning grid right now. So you invest in smart grid. So there are these opportunities which allow countries to build back better. And I think COVID-19 really opens up an opportunity in that respect.
Wonderful. Leongqing,
I'd just like
anything?
to jump in
Yes,
here.
yes, Minister.
I fully agree with Abbas that there are many, bright future ahead of us in this area, and somehow, if you have been noticing this kind of carbon commitments that's made by China, then Japan and South Korea, you can feel a momentum in climate action. And I would say that it's absolutely right, Abbas. I agree with you that actually many of the countries, developing countries, can actually look at, how they can jumpstart the economy by going in a green way. Just like how some of them has skipped the installation of a landline on telephone to go straight into mobile. And here again, can we go from a full power grid, to one that is a solar mini microgrid in the community? The price of solar PV has actually dropped significantly, and it's really commercially viable right now. If you have the space, actually it's a very viable option. So is wind energy. In Singapore, I wish we had more land for solar, but even if we were to use the entire area of Singapore for solar, it will not be enough. But having said that, we are not just giving up on that. We're going to look at alternative spaces. Just like we have now one solar PV that's being built on a reservoir, another being planned. So we're using our water spaces for capturing solar energy. So we will look at all these unconventional places, vertical solar panels, to maximize the capturing of solar energy.
While I still have you online, what's the government of Singapore's quick response to nuclear energy? Is it completely off the deck?
In this particular, at this moment, the technology is really not on the cards for us, because it's not just the technology, but the fact that for safety, we probably have to sanitize and isolate 30 kilometers around the nuclear plant, which to us is just too land intensive for that purpose. But we are watching that space. We are doing some research into the area, and who knows, technological advancement may make it a feasible option for us
to mitigate
not in the next
by mitigating
2 to 3
safety down the road. Leongqing, would you like to comment on it?
I want to reply, please, to Whelan on the chat, to say the reason why people don't vote for quiet water is because the society is mostly corrupt and people can't be trusted to deliver. Maybe. I think, quite a lot of policy issues, we sort of think about corruption as being one of the impediments, but it's a hard question to tackle, but I think that we have seen some successes, right? And even in sort of relatively developing countries. So I'll give you an example. In Phnom Penh in Cambodia, you can drink water from the tap. And it's extraordinary. The water utility is listed on the Cambodian Stock Exchange, right? So you would think, in a country where still quite a lot of the budget comes from foreign aid, and you would think, accusations of, and also that there are other accusations of corruption as well. But sometimes all you need is the will to succeed, and the demand for the need is great, right? So in Phnom Penh, they did have succeeded in building a water utility there. sort of professional, and they do charge at cost recovery. And indeed, they charge such that they are a viable listing on the stock exchange. So it's true what you say, that this is a weight sometimes on success, but it's not true all the time.
Thank you. I'd like to very quickly respond to Beng Xiong. You had said, the moderator had made a sweeping and unfair remark by saying that with a 0.1% drop in economy, jobs will go. Sorry, I was just playing the devil's advocate. It's not that, I believe in that. I just wanted Feng Yuan to respond to that. And I completely agree. It's too simplistic to argue that it's going to result in jobs, right? I take your point. I'd like to go to another question by Johnny Tan. His question is this. I'd like to put it to the panel. Singapore is currently one of the major oil refining countries in the region. In our effort to push for renewable energy, what will be the future economic impact to Singapore in this sector? Would the minister care to comment first, and the others can come in?
Thank you so much, Viswa. I was hoping to have this question because I'm sure this issue is on many people's mind, because
Yes.
A large part of our carbon emission actually comes from our refinery. And as you know, we are a hub for petrochemical, and indeed, much of our products that's made here is exported. However, the carbon footprint is counted as ours. So we have a few choices, right? You know, I always have this proposition, right? If we think that it's possible, you know, tomorrow, imagine the possibility, the option of us just cutting off Jurong Island and having it towed somewhere, right? And in Singapore, immediately our carbon footprint will drop significantly. On the other hand, if we tow it, say, to Batam or Bintan, Indonesia will probably, you know, not have that needle move very much because it's such a large country with a large population. So has the world actually been better with this move? The answer is no. Actually, nothing has changed because the plants are still producing. Feng Yuan is still, you know, buying her consumer goods. We are still buying our cars that comes with plastics. We're still buying our handphone that has plastics in there. We're still using our gloves and masks and PPE that's plastic, right? So actually nothing has changed, unless if we can produce it better in Singapore, cleaner in Singapore, and treat its waste better in Singapore. And actually that's what we are aiming to do. Such investments is actually very huge. For someone to sink in a cracker plant in Singapore, it's hundreds of millions of dollars. So for them, you know, there's a certainty of investment that as a country, we need to give them. So we have to give them time to adjust. And so it's not something that we can make a decision overnight and say, outlaw any of these petrochemical in Singapore. But we want to move them to best of class production so that they can do it in the most efficient way, in the least pollutive way. But at the same time, you know, look at how we can be part of this circular economy, find ways to, you know, think about getting the feedstock of one company from Jurong Island from the waste of another. This is where I think interesting innovations can take place because we have the downstream chemical industry concentrated in one place. I would just also like to make one more comment on this, is that we want to see best of class, but actually what is really driving many of the companies is financing. Investors, like pension fund investors, they are really taking a long-term view, and they said that if I'm going to invest in some businesses that's going to last me 20, 30 years, what will be the good investments for me? Is it one that is very carbon intensive? Or is it one that is very efficient, that is sustainable? Because of this move by the finance sector, many companies are thinking about producing in a much more sustainable and much more environmentally friendly way. Otherwise, they will be like the petrol kiosks in Singapore in 2040. If you are a petrol kiosk in Singapore in 2040, there's probably very little value left, because maybe 60% of the fleet in Singapore would have turned electric. Your business would have halved by then. So companies are putting that long-term view and say in 20 to 30 years time, the world is going to be very different. The world is going to demand a totally different standard from us. If we do not want to be caught with assets, plants, installations, ships that is low in standard, that nobody else would want to take it from us, that would see its value dropped, we better do something right now. And so I would just want to assure our young people like Celine, Feng Yuan, that actually we are not standing still. Companies are not standing still. The Singapore government is not standing still. The researchers, the academia are not standing still. A lot of work, a lot of research effort is being put into this area. I think we have someone, Sanjit, that is in the R&D in this domain. And that really is a large, important part of Singapore's R&D focus.
So, Minister, what you said makes a lot of sense from the pragmatic point of view. I guess the challenge we are facing in a topic such as this is you often find tension between pragmatism, hard-nosed pragmatism, where you have to look at the rate of transition from one type of energy to another so that the displacement effect is mitigated, right? On the other hand, there would be those who are climate change activists. And I'm not saying it pejoratively, climate change activists. And I think we do need activists who will constantly remind us that we are too slow, for example, so that we are always on our toes. We are kept on our toes. Governments are kept on its toes. So the climate change activists would say, look, 2040, that's too little, too far. It's too late. The harm's done. The harm is being done even as we speak today, because right now the rate of increase in temperature, the rise in temperature is already 1.1. It's going to go up very soon to 1.5 if you don't watch it, 2030. These are the kinds of realities we're talking about. So we need to strike that balance. And that's what this topic is about, So Abbas, how would you respond to the minister? The minister is really talking about the need for us to transit from where we are to the next one very carefully so that the displacement effect is not too severe. It's something we can bear with, and we do it responsibly.
I would just add that, when we looked at electrification, as I explained in the chat, that's really half the story, half the equation, because you can electrify your fleet, but where do you get the electricity is the important question. Yeah. If you get it from fossil fuel, then the result is that, yes, you get cleaner air, but you are still having your carbon footprint, right?
Although it'll be less, it'll still be net.
It will be less, but it is still not as environmentally friendly. The impact on carbon footprint reduction will not be as great. So actually what is going concurrently is how do we adjust our energy portfolio? My colleague Chun Sing had said that. How do we adjust our energy portfolio? And we're now looking at, more solar, potentially from other countries as well, so that we can have a greener portfolio, energy source. And I think in the next 20 years is probably where the development will take place as solar energy becomes cheaper, as transportation becomes more environmentally friendly. Please don't forget the cost of the carbon footprint of transportation of energy. Then I think we will come to a nice landing point. So in this process transition, let's not do things that will actually inevitably hurt ourselves in the process without understanding the entire chain or value chain.
Right, I get it. So that's a lot that was highlighted by the minister. So I'd like to put it to the other panelists, Abbas, Feng Yuan, Leong Ching, to comment based on your own experience, based on your own research, and so on.
So I think the minister is absolutely right. So if you look at the literature of energy transitions, say historically, there are people like Carlito Perez, Vaclav Slim, who have looked at this in the past. So energy transitions take a lot of time. They don't happen overnight.
Yeah.
So it's 40, 50 years typically when you move from one primary energy source to another. And the reason is exactly what the minister said, that it's not just about the fuel source, but it's about the infrastructure, the supporting infrastructure that needs to be put in place. So these things take their own time. So that's one point. But that said, there are a lot of hopeful signs that are already happening. So let me give you an example from India. National Thermal Power Corporation of India, which is one of the largest coal fired plant companies in the world, they are now making a shift out of coal and going into renewable in a big way because they see the writing on the wall. And most smart companies are actually seeing the writing on the wall. So BP used to be British Petroleum, now they call themselves Beyond Petroleum. They've actually rebranded themselves. So there is this whole issue of stranded assets. That there are companies that fear that oil will have to be left in the ground, or the coal will have to be left in the ground. So that is the second point. And the third and final point I want to make is that there is this task force on climate change related disclosures, which Mark Carney, who's the Bank of England chairman, who's spearheading it. I think transparency makes a lot of difference. If companies start showing their exposure to fossil fuels, that also moves the needle, I think, somewhat in terms of moving away from. So I do think transparency helps.
In Asia, Abbas, in Asian countries and societies, is there resistance from companies to be a lot more transparent? The sustainability reporting, for example.
It would be unfair to single out Asia. There's nothing,
Right, nothing unique negatively about
There's
us.
nothing unique about,
Okay.
All companies are there to make a profit. So I don't hold that against them. But I do want to give one piece of advice, maybe unsolicited, to the government of Singapore, which is that carbon is probably going to be the most traded commodity in the 21st century and maybe in the 22nd century too. And given that Singapore is a financial hub, one of the leading financial hubs in the world, I would, strongly suggest that Singapore position itself to be the leader in carbon trading. And it already is doing a lot of interesting things, which we are working with them on. But this is something to keep an eye on, that, Singapore as a hub for carbon trading, because this is going to be one of the big lines of business in the future.
Right, thank you. Yongqing?
Thanks very much. I wanted to thank Abbas also for bringing up the Minister's point to a close on the past dependencies of large infrastructure. That really, including the financing, of course. So that's the bugbear, right? Generally for environmental issues, the large-scale infrastructures means that the past dependencies do tend to be really entrenched. And that speaks, if I may, to link that to Jerry's point, which has now disappeared from the chat. I think Jerry had earlier asked about temporal myopia, right? About how it's really difficult to take actions which take a long time to show results in exactly the same way that, as you had said, Abbas, and also Minister had alluded to, because the past dependencies are entrenched, and to get incremental change to show results, it will take maybe 10, 15 years. And certainly by the time that's 3 electoral cycles. So Jerry's point is, how do we overcome such temporal myopia? And that's why I started my tonight by saying that one of the themes of the essay was to throw up our hands in despair, because it seems to be a problem without a solution, because nobody wants to solve it. It's not going to get you elected the next time, and so on. So one of the things that may be helpful is the much vaunted long-term planning of the Singapore governance model. I think if we do indeed, and this is not just Singapore, but many other countries where environmental issues have become salient for the people, it therefore becomes attractive for political self-response. As Abbas has said, it's no longer tomorrow, it's today. So we see this in China, the government there being really responsive to problems of air pollution and so forth. So to Jerry's point, I do think that even within a 4 to 5 year cycle, we can sort of get the momentum going, and maybe past dependency will work for us, because if you lock in something in one electoral term, it goes on for 2 or 3 decades after that.
Right, thank you. Feng Yuan?
I totally agree with Minister Fu's claim about gradual transitions. And I would just like to touch on the economic aspect, because I think economic systems also need time to transit and find a new way of operation. As energy gets more expensive, companies need to find a new way to make profits. Trends like fast fashion, massive consumptions needs to change, and including the way of advertisement. So I think that we need time for companies and for the entire economy to find a new model of how to sustain itself. But in the meanwhile, I also like to raise that time is limited for climate change. There's only 14 more years before we reach the 1.5 degrees Celsius cap. By then, we will be facing a lot of natural disasters, and there will be a lot of unimaginable consequences. So I would like to urge everyone in this webinar and everyone in the public that in the meanwhile, this transition is taking place, we should be conscious of our own consumption, our lifestyle, to reduce consumption in terms of travel, in terms of our consumption of goods. So individual actions count, and everyone should start right now, because that is the thing that's the immediate actions that we can afford to take.
Right. Excellent. So far we've been talking about the macro issues. We've been talking about what governments, what different governments can do, what individual governments can do. I think this is a good time for us to segue into what the individual can do, because that's the lowest hanging fruit. How can we change our own attitudes? And we shouldn't scoff at it. It's not just always the government or the large corporations, us. What is it that we can do as individuals? Let's spend some time talking about that. Now, Feng Yuan, in your essay, you highlighted this thing called the pleasure principle, right? It's actually a Freudian concept. Would you want to elaborate a little bit on that?
Okay. So the principle talks about the human nature of avoidance of pain and suffering. So living a more sustainable lifestyle definitely means that we have to sacrifice some of our pleasure. For example, less vacations, shorter showers.
Or being able to drive a Ferrari that guzzles petrol.
Yes, if we can afford one. Mm-hmm. Those sacrifices, some people are not willing to make those sacrifices because they just have that natural refrain from suffering or pain. So I think that is a main principle driving our reluctance to tackle climate change. Right. And also because the consequences and impacts are not really directly felt by a lot of people. For example, youth in Singapore is actually quite shielded from the impacts of climate change. We didn't experience any natural disasters, and not really about global warming as well, because Singapore is always very warm. Correct. So I think there's a lack of emotional ties and empathy.
Yes. Yeah. And Leong Ching, as a person who studies behavior, how do you think, you talked about it at the start, right? How this whole climate issue, because it's not a high impact thing that's affecting you, like something like jobs, losing jobs, for example. It's easier for us to put it on the back burners. How can we change that attitude? Is there something we can do to change it?
It's really hard, Vishwa. I would count myself as being quite an environmentally friendly person, but during this COVID, I just ordered like Takein and Grab food, and of course I land up with all the disposable things, and I think, oh man, I feel ashamed of myself every time I get a package from Amazon, and then I see all the brown boxes, right? And then that's exactly it, right? The biases in human behavior. So what I study is behavioral change. And one of the most difficult things is the environment, just because it's so easy not to be environmentally friendly. It's so easy not to recycle. As Selena Feng Yuan put it, there's a lot of pain and suffering involved, right?
Yeah.
So for those of us who like meat, right, every meal or every steak it feels like it's heresy, right? So I think part of what we can do is to make it more effortless to do the right thing, and it doesn't have to be so difficult. So one of the things I think the Singapore government has done right in the new HDB flats is to put in the dual chute system.
That's right.
That just makes recycling much easier. So you will find the flats with the dual chute recycle far more, like 3 times more than those without. And it's not, it's not that people who buy these new flats are environmentally so much greener. It's just that the architecture allows them to manifest this part of themselves. So I would say there are lots more architectures such as these ones that we can build. And if I may suggest price, even though I earlier talked about the limits of price, price as a signal and as a cost, as a sort of step to us to behave in a certain way is very useful.
Can you see price being used as a carrot and not a stick? The price strategy being used as a carrot and not a stick?
Yeah, so that's a great question, Vishal. You know how there was a time where I think Fraser and Neave had a 20-cent return. So they had a machine up and they put, like, if you put this bottle, it's 20 cents. So that motivates behavior, right? You pay people to be green. But it's really hard to sustain because truth is it's not worth 20 cents. That's recyclable.
Somebody's got to pay for it.
Right. So the economic case will have to be extremely innovative. So, but you're right. I mean, price is a deterrent and price is an incentive. It works both ways.
Right. And I'd like to put the same question to Minister. I'm sure as Minister, looking at sustainability and how sustainability is sustainable, I think it's a very, very important thing. What are the carrots and sticks that we have in mind, the government has in mind? Of course, I have had people even suggest to me that we should shame people a lot more. I'm not sure whether that's the direction that we want to take in this particular context, that we want to shame people who are not environment conscious and so on. So I'm sure we all like to hear your views on this, Minister.
Well, actually, the solutions are in the chat because there's so many suggestions here that align with what we are thinking and what we are doing. So I think we have someone, I think it's Alvin, suggesting that we should have a better recycling infrastructure.
That's right.
I agree with that. It's too cumbersome to
walk down.
Recycle your batteries. No, your batteries, your e-waste.
Yeah.
Those are only sort of available in the CC and in some shopping malls. So I agree that the infrastructure should be improved so that it's easier to recycle. There's also a suggestion earlier that producers should take back. That's also something that we are considering. I think
could you elaborate? Could you elaborate on that, Minister?
Yeah, who says that should impose all the manufacturers or any item to take back any item that they produce for recycling. For example, electronic gadgets. In this way, these producers will be more environmentally conscious before they produce. So yes, the concept about extended responsibility on the producers is something that we are thinking about. And we are thinking about it in a few ways. First of all, is on packaging. Producers can do a lot in reducing the way that we package.
Yeah.
So sometimes you have seen how producers will have a product that's this big, but then a sachet that's this big, and then goes into the box that's this big. I mean, it's really, just wasteful packaging. And you can also say there's misrepresentation. But the fact is that if we are more responsible as a producer, we can actually reduce packaging. So that's on packaging. We're also looking at electronic waste because e-waste is one of those waste streams that we think we are able to recycle and recover the values. There are values in there that we should find some ways to help us recover better. So e-waste is another one. We're looking at how can we get the producers to think about recycling their waste better. So for example, if I buy a fridge, I may require the producers to take back the old fridge, for example, so that we have a better way of recovering. Although fridge is not exactly the e-waste, but this is the concept that we are working with. Another area that we are very interested is bottling. So how can we require the producers to recover bottles better? In some countries, they have what Leong Cheng has described. You have a reverse vending machine. So you put in your used bottles and then you get some vouchers or money out of it. The infrastructure, the vending machine, the collection and all that, perhaps the producers can shoulder a bit more responsibilities. And also use of plastic bags. I mean, there's always a perennial problem as to why can't we just ban plastic bags? I think the fact is plastic is a very useful commodity or a material. It's not permeable, so actually it helps us to bring our wet or cold ice cream back from supermarkets, back home. It's much more environmentally friendly than say a paper bag. A paper bag uses more water and actually it degrades the environment even more. So the problem with plastic in many countries is how it's disposed. In many countries, when they do not incinerate their waste and they basically just dump their waste in landfill, plastic is one of those material that will not go away even after thousands of years. And when it gets into the water system, the river system, into the sea, it gets into the marine life. It's a whole, problem of pollution and also a contamination of our food from marine and so on. So this is an issue with disposal and a problem with production. So we need to find better way to make plastics. We need to find better way to dispose of plastics. And we definitely should think about ways to reduce wastage. So in Singapore,
there's a question, Minister, just while you're at this point, from Z Kwan here. What are the challenges and actions for waste to raw materials to close the loop for a circular economy? Is it the maturity of R&D or the lack of investments? Example, Singapore is pushing for e-waste collection framework, extended producer framework, but what is beyond after collection?
Actually, that's a very good question. And the answer is not a simple one. It depends on the technology. Some technologies are more mature and actually is ready for implementation. So actually, NEA and Shell has gone into a study on the feasibility of having a pyrolysis plant. Pyrolysis is simply put a recycling of old plastics. So it's a chemical recycling. So that's a proven technology. Shell has done it in some other jurisdiction, but they're studying the feasibility in Singapore. So plastic has some solutions. We are also making some headway on our incinerated ash. We have recycled our incinerated ash into building material. So if I looked out the window in front of the environment building, the hard court is made of what we call new sand. So different waste streams, different material are at different stages of technological breakthrough. And that's why I'm very hopeful. And that's why I'm very confident that we will make steps. We will make important steps over the next few years as R&D, reaches a certain level. And I will tell you that there are many interests and many teams working on different challenges, different problems. That gives me the confidence that my optimism is not unfounded.
So we're talking about plastic and also in the same breath when we're talking about styrofoam, for example, right? These are often cited. You talked about how we dispose plastic, right? Just now. What are the plans currently for disposing plastic in a sustainable way? I know it sounds like a contradiction of terms.
So in Singapore right now, we incinerate, which means that we take it off the environment. It doesn't get into the river system. It doesn't get into the sea. it doesn't get into, the stomach of a dolphin or a sea turtle, but just burning it produces carbon dioxide.
Yeah.
So we have a problem as well. We're not happy with just incineration.
Burning it, yeah.
We should think about way to recover and reduce the carbon footprint. Thus the work with Shell to look at recycling the plastics so that the life is extended. It's like how
Yes.
we have closed the loop with water.
Yeah.
Every single drop of water in Singapore,
It's channeled.
it's reused.
Yeah.
So similarly, I think we're looking at plastics, we're looking at other material, but each one has its own sort of R&D life cycle. They're at different stages. So we just have to sometimes, work on it real hard and hope that we have some good news.
Surely in the area of styrofoam, I mean, this is an area that I feel that compared to plastic, styrofoam, I'm sure we can get rid of it, because there are actually now substitutes, right? I see recycled material being used instead of styrofoam.
I dislike styrofoam as much as you, Viswa.
But what can we do about it? But I really think we can get rid of it.
We can ban it if that is the solution that everybody agrees with it.
Well, why don't we?
So we have to find a solution. You know why? You know who am I thinking about? It's really the migrant worker that is working outdoor and eating their lunch with styrofoam boxes. That's the group that I am very minded. So we need to find a solution, but we need to find a solution that doesn't impose a cost on them.
Right. Abbas, I'm sure you have studied this sort of issues before. Any thoughts in other countries and so on? Because it is an issue.
It is an issue, Vishwa, but I think it's a very difficult issue. I mean, and anybody who's offering simple solutions, I can assure you they're wrong, because there is no simple solution to these things. So plastics, there's a reason why plastics are so ubiquitous, right? Because, for example, in transporting food, there was an estimate that you could keep food fresh for weeks using plastic, but if you don't use plastic, they go bad in a few days. So these are the trade-offs, and as the minister said, often the poor are disproportionately hit hardest when you have these blunt banning. So there was a study in Washington D.C. where they banned plastic bags, and the study found that plastic usage actually went up as a result, because people tend to reuse plastic bags they get in the shopping mall, for trash, for example.
Right.
But when they banned it, they started buying more plastic bags for the trash. So these kind of policy changes need a lot of, thinking of unintended consequences. And unfortunately, there are no simple solutions. So I'm sorry, I'm not giving you a very good answer.
No. I think this is important because you see the question I asked about plastic and styrofoam and so on are questions that have to be asked because it's on the lips of many Singaporeans, and this is an opportunity to hear what the government's perception, what the government's dilemma might be, and it's perfectly fine for you to also highlight that it is not an easy problem to solve. Although optics-wise, it looks very easy to solve. Just ban it. But the solution is not as straightforward as that. I think that's what I'm hearing, right?
Viswa, what is the big problem with plastic right now? Is that we are fighting against the very, very cheap virgin plastics. Oil price have gone so low because aviation sector has not been flying very much. So the demand for oil, the fossils have actually plummeted. So actually, virgin plastics has become very cheap, and because of that, plants that were recycling plastics has actually been challenged because their product is really become very, very less competitive. So we have to think about how do we do this in Singapore, and we are seriously considering having our own plastics recycling plant.
That's wonderful. That actually answers a couple of people have asked that question. Where are we in finding a solution to disposing plastic? or recycling plastic.
Yeah.
I think
So-
that's a great
So
answer.
we are looking at a few solutions: chemical recycling or mechanical recycling. We're studying that
Right.
with
That-
different groups.
Right. There's Jerry Sim who's asked this question. One approach is to change the conversation from disposal to reuse. Right. We haven't gone into reusing. I mean, you just touched on reusing, right? Reuse, reuse, reuse until the time is up, right? So you will actually reduce disposal, right? That's the point these guys are making. Jerry is making disposal to reuse. The problem is that often we are tempted to discard plastic bags, or at the most use them as bin lining because they are too thin and insubstantial and so on. It is easy to perpetuate this use and dispose. So how about reusing? Not just plastic, but as a philosophy across the board, reusing. Where are we on that continuum, Minister?
Well, we are. That has been the 3 R's has been our motto for the last few years. We are really stressing, reduce, reuse, and recycle. Each one of them, it's important. So we are not happy with the recycling rates of plastics, for example. So that's an area that we want to really look into. We are also not particularly happy with food waste. We think that we can extract more out of our food waste. And e-waste is another area that I mentioned earlier. We need to think about, how to extract more value and recycle the commodities, the materials in our e-waste. Right.
Since we talk about reuse, there's a larger issue, which is reduce, right? We can certainly reduce consumption, whether it's electronic products, whether it's food, and so on. We can reduce. The other day I was having a conversation with Lim Chuan Po from SFA, Singapore Food Agency, right? We're talking about a major part of the national strategy is actually to reduce the food wastage. And how strong is the emphasis by the government in trying to reduce wastage across the board? That's an attitudinal behavioral issue as well. Minister.
Yeah. So I think it's important for us to, especially in this time. So I get this question a lot, right? I mean, COVID-19 pandemic, we are all trying to get out of a public health challenge and also an economic crisis. So will sustainability be the solution or be the cause of issue for us? So actually, I would like to propose to the industries and also everyone here as individual consumers that actually starting to think about reducing is the best way to save costs. So I mentioned about packaging, for example. How can we reduce packaging so that actually save us costs? And actually, if we looked at the some of the downstream process re-engineering, we can look at ways to reduce our intake as well. So an example would be, in Singapore, in the food business, some of our companies are selling the entire plant vegetable as a product. So actually, if you go to RedMart, you can order basil or kailan or kale in its entire plant with the roots. The reason why we do that is because we do not want to go through the process of cutting off some of the leaves, cutting off some of the plants and the stems, and as a result, actually the vegetables don't keep as well. So if we can deliver the entire plant, it's fresher, it has less wastage, and actually the consumer can get more out of the vegetable. So it takes a bit of re-engineering of the processes so that we can get used to a new way of consumption. The other thing that I think will really move the needle is really for companies in adjacent processes to work together. So we talked about how the food industry can actually use its waste as a feedstock to downstream processes. So some companies, for example, would use their food waste as a feedstock to a agricultural, for the fish, or it can be used for plants, as fertilizer. So this is how I think on a system basis, when we start thinking, of the processes in a circular basis,
circular economy.
That's where we can find really needle eng initiatives.
Right. And there's a question from Liu Rijing. This question is for Feng Yuan, but any panelists can respond to it. With population growth, there is increased rearing of animals for their meat, egg, milk, etc. As we know, methane is also a greenhouse gas, right? And animal rearing is one of the sources. Are there any ways to mitigate the effects from methane source? Feng Yuan, the question is for you.
Okay. Well, currently, I'm not aware of any specific technology for that, but I think we can knowledge about how to contain carbon can be transferable to methane. There's currently a technology about collecting and storing carbon. So perhaps scientists can look into that aspect in controlling the methane emission. In the meanwhile, there's also movements to encourage people to eat less beef to save the environment from methane. Also, may I just add a quick comment about 3 Rs and waste management? Because just now we were talking about plastic waste management, and that actually reminded me of a research I've done about Sweden's waste to energy program. So basically, it's an exercise of all the 3 Rs. The residents will recycle their plastic into different bins. So it starts from their habits at home to recycle them into different categories, and they will send those waste to a main station every week. And those plastic, very interestingly, are actually sent to a power station to generate energy. And you may actually think that burning plastic to generate energy will cause a lot of carbon, but with a quick Google search, you'll realize that burning fossil fuels, will generate 2,249 pounds per megawatt hour, but the Sweden's program of burning plastic only generates 986 pounds of carbon dioxide per megawatt hour. So I think that's an aspect which we can look into because it's very cost efficient. It serves as a source of energy, and it also solves the problem of waste management.
Anybody else?
So if I could come in?
Yes, please, Abbas.
So on this issue of beef and meat, you do have these, what are called plant-based meats, Impossible Burger, and
that's right.
So I'm a vegetarian, so I don't know, but my wife tells me that they taste as good. So and then of course you have.
You must always trust the wife.
Exactly, and you have lab-based meats also that are promising. But I wanted to add to the minister's excellent points on the reduce part. There's a very interesting concept called extended producer responsibility. And those of us who grew up in the 70s, I don't know whether you remember, but the soft drink glass bottles, yes. You took them back to the shop and you got a few cents. So that's what extended producer responsibility means, that you can the producer takes back the plastic or the glass bottles for a fee. So there's an incentive for the consumer to take it back. That is, I think, one of the more promising policy initiatives, even for plastic, in that you sort of put the onus on the company that's producing to recycle and to reduce. So right. I think that's something to be you could look at closely.
Right. There's a question here from Chandra Mohan Nair. Do oil companies have substantial say in the use of other forms of energy? I believe he's talking about clean energy for vehicles and other uses, and control in pricing in various countries and also in Singapore. Essentially, whether the government is influenced by these oil companies, the big oil companies. Is the government beholden to these oil companies or not? Minister, this is clearly for you.
Yeah, so I think that although we have a very large petrochemical hub, many oil majors have the operations here, there's actually no subsidy on fuel. So we pay, in fact, I think we pay a tax on our fuel. So to us, the government, there's actually no incentive to use oil or not. So it's really about pricing the commodity, pricing the fuel correctly so that it doesn't distort the market. Like what Abbas was trying to mention earlier, where many countries actually have chosen to subsidize their fuel. So the decision for petrochemical and the decision on what type of fuel our cars would use, actually it is based on two considerations. First is the air emission. In other words, how can we have cleaner air for Singaporeans? On this score, I think electric vehicle is much better, much more cleaner than combustion energy vehicle. The second is really about energy efficiency. Electrification allow us the opportunity to introduce other form of fuel into the portfolio, as I mentioned earlier. We are already on LNG, which is much cleaner than, say, the heavy fossil or coal in electrification. But if we are able to go into alternative energy and have a blend, then obviously it moves us even closer towards carbon mitigation. So electrification has that advantage that fossil or combustion and engines do not have.
Right. The time now is 9:25. We have to end the discussion by 9:30. So I'd like to now invite each panelist to make your closing remarks. Could we start with you, Leong Ching?
Thanks, Joshua. This is really nice instance because I was trying to reply to Nguyen's question earlier. She said, to my points about recycling, she said, if recycling was made easier, would that lead to excessive consumption and hence to a sense of entitlement? She's talking about negative spillover and perverse effects from behavior. So, a lot of questions on controlling behavior, how do we change behavior, and how do we make it sticky? I would like to leave the webinar and everybody tonight with this message that we behave in a certain way when we respond short-term to incentives, but the question of identity guides our overall behavior across a lifetime. And the issue of who you are and who you're not then talks about conformity and the kind of society you live with. So I would say in our drive towards a greener Singapore, we just have to develop a collective identity that this is the sort of persons that we are and this is the sort of persons that we are not. Of course, we will fail by and large, but we keep the compass true. Thank you.
Right. So you're talking about not just being focused on what we do and do well, but also what we stand for as individuals and as a society, as a collective. Right. Thank you.
So it's deeper than a momentary behavior. It's a very deep-seated identity. So you don't eat meat because it's the kind of person that you are. And you don't waste because it's the kind of person you are and kind of people that we are.
Yeah, and I think this would be very useful feedback for the committee on that's looking at Singapore together at this point in time. It's very, very useful feedback because I think it's important for us to ask those inconvenient questions about what we stand for. Thank you. Feng Yuan?
Well, as the youth here, I would like to make a message to address to the youth watching this webinar. Hearing from the sharing of all the panelists, I would say that I can hear a lot of opportunities and possibilities for the future in tackling climate change. So here I would like to call for all youths to have the enterprising spirit and to actively think of solutions and propose new possibilities and potential proposals to solve climate change. And please do trust in yourself, and you can send those proposals to the Singapore government. I'm pretty sure Minister Fu would love to receive them.
I'm very sure.
Yeah. So I would just like to end off with calling for the youth to have a right attitude to understand the bigger picture of climate change and how it's going to affect our generations and the future generation, and also have the value and the willingness to contribute and sacrifice a small portion of self-interest for the greater good. And I think that value will sustain us in fighting this crisis. Thank you.
Wonderful. We have a lot of hope in the future because of young people like you. Thank you very much, Feng Yuan. Abbas?
So I'd like to thank the organizers and NUS. This was a great discussion. And I want to conclude by saying, referring to something that the minister said, which is that Singapore is a small country. But despite that, Singapore has really led the way in several aspects. So look at, for example, urban design, the smart use of density, the very forward-looking investments in public transport that you made in the 1980s. These are all, very, very significant achievements which now the rest of the world looks to with admiration. So I feel climate change also offers a similar opportunity for Singapore. So as I said, carbon trading, carbon markets, Singapore could be a leader in this aspect. And similarly in developing other frontier technologies related to electric vehicles or battery technology. So I really feel that the world will benefit, and the world is looking to Singapore for its leadership. So thank you very much.
Thank you for your confidence in Singapore, Abbas. Thank you. Minister?
Thank you so much. Thank you, Viswa. Thanks, Abbas, for the compliments. It's very humbling to hear that. But I would say that sometimes Singapore's capability is overstated. We are a very small country. We don't move the needle in the global scheme of things. But as a small country, we somehow have a knack of looking for opportunities when we are faced with a lot of challenges, and when we have a lot of constraints. That's how we can be very innovative as well. So this is exactly where we are right now. We really need very innovative solutions to many of the problems that we are facing on the sustainability front. And I think that's where the smallness, the compact, the closeness between policymakers, industries, and the people give us an advantage. Why do I say that? Because I find this area, after I've come on board for the last few months, to be an area where there's a lot of technological changes. And when you have that, it opens up opportunities very quickly. And that's where if we have the nimbleness and respond quickly with policy changes, I think we are in a good position to take advantage of those technological shifts. But I would not want to underestimate the need for us to bring the people along, because as many of you have alluded to, changes, major shifts, major changes can be very disruptive. It can change the way that we live. It can change the cost of things that we have been consuming. And we may have to make, as Leong Ching said, some of the inconvenience, take in some of the inconvenience in our day-to-day lives. So that's where I think we need all of you to help us to forge that identity, to forge that commonality, that forge that consensus on how quickly, how fast, and in what direction we should move on the sustainable front. Some of you have alluded that, if I have to move this too quickly, in 5 years' time, politically, I'm subjected to an election, I may not get elected, right? So how do we as a country, I'm not saying this from a PAP point of view, I'm saying this from a country point of view, how do we as a country move forward consistently so that our long-term plans, like the plans that we have for 2040 and beyond, can be implemented effectively? And I think that's the challenge for us. If Singapore can do it better, more effective, faster, with less cost than others, then I think this will be our competitive advantage.
Thank you, Minister. You've been most honest, most frank. The truth of the matter is, on a subject like this, we can't expect absolute consensus. We can't expect everyone to agree on everything. That's the beauty of it, which is the reason why we need more conversations like this, so that we can forge that consensus that we have been talking about. It's not going to come naturally. It's going to come with debate, with some pain, with some inconvenience. And we must be prepared to go through that process and not shortcut that process. That's my request. Now, we tend to look at problems like this in a binary fashion. That's the problem, because quite often, because we are so adversarial in the way we look at things, that it's very binary. You're either for the environment or against the environment. But actually, most of us are somewhere in the middle of the spectrum. And therefore, I would suggest that we move away from a zero-sum sort of approach to looking at this. And for me, that's one of the strongest takeaway from today. I've learned a lot from today's discussion. It is not about taking extreme positions. It's about finding the middle ground, right? But Singapore is always known for our exceptionalism, to be exceptional. And I would really urge that we put that to the test in tackling the climate change issue. I think we can afford to be bolder, especially in demonstrating that boldness, that political will, and so on to our younger generation, people like Feng Yuan. They need to see us demonstrate that we are exceptional, we are bold enough to do that. The final point I want to make is COVID-19 is a massive opportunity for us. It's a great opportunity for us to rethink the way we organize ourselves, to rethink the way we have been traveling like crazy and increasing the carbon footprint. There are many things now that we can rethink and relook, and we need to use this opportunity. You see, events like COVID-19 are great teachers of history, great teachers for us. The question I have for all of us is whether we are prepared to be good students. On that note, I'd like to thank my panelists for a wonderful and illuminating conversation and a very honest conversation, and you, the audience, for staying with us. Thank you, and good night.
Thank you, panelists, for your insights on this topic, and thank you, Mr. Vishwa, for moderating the session. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for participating in tonight's You Alive session, brought to you by NUS Alumni Relations. We would greatly appreciate it if you could share your feedback on this session by scanning the QR code on screen. Do stay tuned to our Alumnet website and social media channels for more upcoming events. We will close this session in 5 minutes. Take care, keep well, and stay healthy.